Welcome to Void of Fears, where the line between reality and nightmares blur with every tale. What you're about to hear has happened to someone, somewhere, perhaps even someone just like you. Our community continues to grow, and now we're reaching for 100,000 subscribers. If these glimpses into the unknown call to you, please consider subscribing. Now let's dive into tonight's story. The fluorescent lights hummed overhead, casting harsh shadows across the cramped hospital room. Paul Davidson's weathered hands trembled as he reached for the plastic cup of water on his bedside table, his 71-year-old body ravaged by something far worse than the emphysema that would officially claim his life. His son Mike shifted uncomfortably in the vinyl chair, digital recorder clutched in his sweaty palm. For 30 years, his father had dropped cryptic hints about his time in the military, about classified work in the Nevada desert, about things that weren't meant for human eyes. Now, with death approaching like a slow-moving storm, Paul had finally agreed to tell the truth. The afternoon sun slanted through the hospital's grimy windows, illuminating dust motes that danced in the stale air. Outside, Las Vegas continued its relentless pursuit of entertainment and excess, completely unaware that one of its dying residents held secrets that could shatter humanity's understanding of its place in the universe. "You recording?" Paul's voice was barely a whisper, each word a struggle against lungs that felt like they were filled with sand and something darker. Mike nodded, pressing the red button with fingers that shook slightly. He'd been dreading this conversation for months, ever since his father had called him, with that strange, urgent tone in his voice. "Go ahead, Dad." Paul closed his eyes, and for a moment, Mike thought he might have drifted off. The morphine drip had been increased that morning, and the doctors had warned that Paul's lucid moments were becoming fewer and farther between. But then his father's voice emerged, stronger now, as if drawing strength from memories he'd kept buried for decades. "March 15th, 1983. That's when my life changed forever, son. That's when I learned that everything we think we know about our place in the universe is a lie." Paul's eyes opened, staring at something beyond the hospital room walls, beyond the Nevada desert that stretched endlessly outside. I was 31 years old, cocky as hell, and stupid enough to think I understood how the world worked. Mike had heard fragments of this story before, during late-night conversations when his father had had too much to drink. Stories about classified projects, about technology that didn't belong to any earthly government, about colleagues who had simply vanished one day without explanation. But those stories had always been incomplete, told in whispers and half-sentences, as if Paul were afraid that even speaking about them might bring unwanted attention. "I had a reputation in the electronics field back then," Paul continued, his voice growing stronger as he lost himself in the memory. "Could fix anything with circuits and wires, could reverse engineer equipment that other technicians couldn't even identify. That's what got me recruited for what they called advanced aerospace analysis. Fancy words for something that would have driven most men insane." The old man's breathing became more laboured, but he pressed on with the determination of someone who knew his time was running out. "The call came on a Thursday morning. Man on the phone said his name was Agent Phillips. Said the government had a job for someone with my particular skills. Wouldn't tell me more over the phone. Just an address in Las Vegas and instructions to pack for an extended stay." Mike leaned forward, studying his father's face. Paul's eyes had taken on a distant look, as if he were seeing events from 4 decades ago playing out in the sterile hospital room. "What kind of job?" "The kind that doesn't exist on any official paperwork, son. The kind that makes you sign documents saying that if you ever talk about what you've seen, you'll disappear into a federal prison for the rest of your life." Paul's laugh turned into a coughing fit that lasted nearly a minute. When he recovered, his eyes were watery but focused. I drove out to Las Vegas, met Phillips at a nondescript office building downtown. Grey concrete, no signs, the kind of place that screams government front operation. Paul paused, his fingers working nervously at the edge of his hospital blanket. Phillips was exactly what you'd expect from a government spook. Grey suit, grey hair, grey personality. Spent 3 hours going through my background, my family, my political beliefs, everything. Asked me questions about my loyalty to the United States, about my willingness to keep secrets, about how I'd react if I encountered technology that was beyond my understanding. Mike noticed that his father's hands had stopped trembling. The old man seemed to be drawing strength from finally telling this story, as if the weight of the secret had been slowly crushing him for decades. Made me sign papers that basically said my life belonged to Uncle Sam from that moment forward. Non-disclosure agreements, security clearances, documents that gave them the right to monitor my communications and activities for the rest of my life. Paul's voice carried a bitter edge. Funny thing is, I was excited about it. Thought I was getting recruited for some cutting-edge aerospace project, maybe working on experimental aircraft or satellite technology. What happened next? Next morning, Phillips drove me out into the desert. Took 4 hours on roads that weren't on any map, through checkpoints that didn't officially exist. The further we got from civilization, the more serious everything became. Armed guards, razor wire, warning signs that promised deadly force for unauthorized personnel. Paul's eyes grew distant. Finally arrived at a place that looked like any other military installation from the outside, except for the signs warning that deadly force was authorized beyond the perimeter. Area 51, Mike said quietly, though he'd heard his father reference the facility before. Groom Lake officially, but yeah, that's what everyone called it, though most people have no idea what really goes on there. Paul's voice dropped even lower. The surface facility was just for show, son. The real work happened far below ground, in levels that don't appear on any blueprint or architectural plan. Paul shifted in his hospital bed, wincing as the movement aggravated injuries that had never fully healed. Mike had always wondered about those scars on his father's arms and chest, the ones Paul claimed came from industrial accidents during his military service. Now he was beginning to suspect there was more to those injuries than his father had ever admitted. Phillips handed me off to a woman named Dr. Janet Cole. She was maybe 55, had the kind of cold intelligence that made you think she'd dissect her own mother if it served the mission. PhD in theoretical physics, from MIT, background in exotic materials research, and eyes that had seen things that would break most people's minds. Paul's voice carried a mixture of respect and fear. She took me through security that was tighter than Fort Knox, multiple identity verifications, biometric scans, psychological evaluations. Mike found himself leaning forward, completely absorbed in his father's story. What kind of evaluations? They wanted to make sure I wouldn't crack under pressure, wouldn't start talking to reporters or foreign agents if I saw something that challenged my understanding of reality. Asked me about my religious beliefs, my philosophical outlook, how I'd react if I discovered that humanity wasn't alone in the universe. Paul's laugh was bitter. I thought they were being hypothetical. The heart monitor's steady beeping seemed to grow louder in the silence that followed. Paul took a shuddering breath and continued, his voice becoming more urgent as if he were running out of time. After 6 hours of testing and evaluation, Dr. Cole finally led me to the real facility. We went through a security door that was hidden behind what looked like a maintenance closet, down into an elevator that descended for what felt like forever. When the doors opened, I was standing in a facility that belonged more in a science fiction movie than underneath the Nevada desert. Paul's eyes widened as he relived the memory. Corridors stretching in every direction, laboratories filled with equipment I'd never seen before, and people working on projects that seemed to bend the laws of physics. I saw materials that glowed with their own light, computer systems that were decades ahead of anything in the commercial market, and devices that seemed to manipulate gravity itself. Mike noticed that the afternoon light coming through the hospital window had begun to fade, casting longer shadows across the room. His father's story was taking on an almost hypnotic quality, drawing him deeper into a world of secrets and impossible technologies. Dr. Cole walked me through the main research level, past rooms where scientists were working with substances that seemed to exist in multiple dimensions simultaneously, past computer systems that could process information at speeds that shouldn't have been possible. But she didn't stop at any of those rooms. She kept walking until we reached a section marked Level C, authorized personnel only. Paul's voice took on an edge of excitement mixed with terror. That's where she showed me the reason I'd been brought there. We went through 3 more security checkpoints, each one more restrictive than the last. Retinal scans, voice pattern analysis, genetic sampling. By the time we reached the final door, I felt like I'd been dissected and reassembled. The old man's eyes met his son's directly, and Mike saw something in them that made his blood run cold. It was the look of someone who had seen the impossible and had been forever changed by the experience. The main research bay was enormous, easily the size of an aircraft hangar. Banks of lights illuminated the center of the space, where something sat that shouldn't have existed anywhere on Earth. Paul's voice dropped to barely above a whisper. It was a craft, son, but not like any aircraft I'd ever seen or imagined. Mike held his breath, waiting for his father to continue. Roughly oval-shaped, maybe 35 feet from end to end, made of a material that seemed to absorb light rather than reflect it. The surface was perfectly smooth, with no seams, no rivets, no indication of how it had been assembled. It was as if the entire thing had been grown rather than built, like some kind of metallic organism that had simply materialized into existence. Paul's voice grew stronger as he continued, his technical background evident in the precise way he described what he had seen. The craft showed no signs of conventional propulsion systems. No engines, no exhaust ports, no wings or control surfaces. It just sat there, defying everything I knew about aerodynamics and engineering. Dr. Cole told me they'd recovered it 6 weeks earlier from a crash site near Rachel, Nevada. The impact crater was massive, nearly 200 feet across and 40 feet deep, but the craft itself showed minimal damage. They believed it had performed some kind of controlled emergency landing, using technology that was beyond our understanding. Mike leaned forward, completely absorbed in his father's story. What was it? Where did it come from? That's what they brought me there to find out, but son, that wasn't the most incredible part. Paul's eyes met his son's directly. The craft wasn't empty when they found it. A chill ran down Mike's spine. Outside the hospital window, the sun had nearly set, and the room was growing darker. The fluorescent light seemed to flicker slightly, as if responding to the weight of Paul's words. What do you mean? There were 2 occupants, 2 beings that were almost human, but not quite. One had died in the crash, its body crushed by the impact, despite the craft's protective systems. But the other... Paul's voice trailed off, and he stared at the ceiling for a long moment. The other was still alive. The heart monitor's beeping seemed to grow louder in the silence that followed. Paul took a shuddering breath and continued, his voice barely audible. Dr. Cole led me to the medical facility, a section of Level C that had been converted into something between a hospital and a research laboratory. The technology there was incredible, unlike anything I'd seen, even in the main research areas. Monitoring equipment that could track biological functions I'd never heard of. Atmospheric processors that could create alien environments. Life support systems that seemed to work on principles beyond our understanding. Paul's hands began to shake again, but this time from excitement rather than illness. And in the center of it all, behind a wall, of reinforced glass that was 3 feet thick was a bed containing something that changed everything I thought I knew about life in the universe. Mike found himself gripping the recorder tighter, his knuckles white with tension. What did it look like? It was humanoid, but stretched, as if someone had taken a human form and elongated it according to some alien aesthetic. Maybe 7 feet tall, with limbs that were too long, and joints that bent in ways that shouldn't be possible. Its skin was pale, almost translucent, with a blue-grey tint that seemed to shift and change in the artificial light. Paul's voice became almost reverent, but it was the eyes that got to you. Large, dark, and filled with an intelligence that was both ancient and alien, yet somehow familiar. Paul paused, his breathing becoming more laboured. Dr. Cole told me that Subject 1, that's what they called it, had been unconscious since they brought it in. Its physiology was unlike anything they'd encountered. Bone structure that was somehow both lighter and stronger than human bones, organs that seemed to serve functions they couldn't identify, and a brain that showed electrical activity patterns that defied explanation. Had it communicated at all? Mike asked, his voice barely audible. Not in any way they could understand, but there had been incidents. 3 technicians had requested transfers after working near Subject 1 for extended periods. They reported vivid nightmares, flashes of imagery that seemed to come from somewhere else, and a persistent feeling of being watched even when they were completely alone. Paul's eyes grew distant again, as if he was seeing those early days at the facility playing out before him. Dr. Cole assigned me to work on the craft's systems, to try to understand how it operated and what kind of technology could create something so advanced. The work was unlike anything I'd ever encountered, son. This wasn't just advanced engineering. It was technology that seemed to work on principles our science couldn't even describe. The old man's voice grew stronger as he lost himself in the technical details. Power systems that seemed to draw energy from the fabric of space itself. Navigation equipment that could plot courses through dimensions we didn't even know existed. And propulsion systems that worked without any apparent reaction mass or energy source. Mike noticed that the hospital room had grown significantly darker, and the fluorescent lights were flickering more frequently. His father's story seemed to be having some kind of effect on the electrical systems, though he couldn't understand how that was possible. But it was during my second week there that everything changed. I was working alone in the research bay, trying to understand what appeared to be a control interface, when I felt something behind me. Not heard, felt, like a presence pressing against my consciousness. Paul's voice dropped to a whisper. I turned around, and Subject 1 was standing at the observation window, staring directly at me. Mike felt the hair on his arms stand up. What did you do? I should have called security, should have followed protocol and alerted Dr. Cole immediately. But something in those eyes stopped me. It wasn't hostile or threatening. It was desperate, like it was trying to tell me something urgent and important. Paul's voice became urgent. That's when it happened, son. That's when I first made contact with something not of this world. Paul closed his eyes, his face contorting as if he were experiencing physical pain. Subject 1 pressed its hand against the glass, and suddenly my mind was flooded with images. Not words or sounds, but pure visual information flowing directly into my consciousness. The old man's breathing became rapid and shallow. I saw cities that stretched beyond the horizon, built from materials that seemed to be made of crystallized light, spires that reached into purple skies, transportation systems that moved through the air without any visible means of support, and beings like Subject 1 moving through those cities with a grace and purpose that spoke of a civilization advanced beyond anything we could imagine. Mike noticed that his father's hospital room seemed to have grown colder, and the air itself felt different somehow, charged with an energy that made his skin tingle. But then the images changed, son. The cities began to crumble, The purple skies turned black, and something vast and terrible descended from the spaces between stars. I saw worlds burning, entire civilizations consumed by a darkness that seemed to be alive, moving with intelligence and malevolent purpose. Paul's eyes opened, and they were filled with a terror that seemed to have been building for 40 years. The end of everything, Mike. The end of Subject One's world, and the beginning of something far worse than anyone could imagine. The heart monitor's beeping began to accelerate, and Mike realized that his father's stress levels were spiking dangerously. But Paul seemed determined to continue, as if he knew his time was running out. Subject One wasn't an explorer or a scientist, son. It was a refugee, one of the last survivors of a civilization that had been completely destroyed by something that should never have existed. And through that first contact, it began to share its story with me, piece by piece, image by image. Paul's voice became urgent, as if he were running out of time. Over the following weeks, I developed a connection with Subject One that went beyond anything Dr. Cole or the other researchers had experienced. The being began responding to my presence using the electronic equipment in its room to communicate in ways that should have been impossible. What did it tell you? It told me about its homeworld, a planet they called something that roughly translated to the Garden of First Light. It orbited a star in what we know as the Vega system, about 25 light years from Earth. The planet had been home to a civilization that had achieved perfect harmony between technology and nature, between individual consciousness and collective purpose. Paul's hands clenched into fists as he continued. They had explored the galaxy for thousands of years, seeking knowledge and peaceful contact with other forms of life. Their technology was so advanced that they could travel between stars in a matter of days, could reshape matter at the atomic level, could even manipulate the flow of time itself within limited parameters. Mike felt a mixture of wonder and dread as his father's story continued. The technical details were incredible, but there was something in Paul's voice that suggested this was leading somewhere terrible. But in all their explorations, in all their contact with other civilizations, they had encountered something that should never have existed. Something that moved through space like a plague, consuming entire worlds and leaving nothing but empty darkness behind. Paul's voice became barely audible. Subject One's people called it the Dark Swarm, a collective entity that fed on the life force of entire planets. Not just the biological life, but the spiritual energy, the consciousness itself. It would arrive at a world, envelop it in living darkness, and drain every last spark of life until nothing remained but a dead husk drifting through space. Mike felt his blood turn to ice. What happened to them? The Dark Swarm reached the Garden of First Light 3 years before Subject One crashed on Earth. The being's entire civilization fought against it, using weapons and defenses that could reshape reality itself. They created barriers that existed in multiple dimensions, unleashed forces that could destroy stars, and even attempted to manipulate time to prevent the swarm's arrival. Paul's voice broke slightly, but nothing could stop it. The Dark Swarm was older than their civilization, older than most of the galaxy itself. It had consumed thousands of worlds, absorbing their knowledge and power, growing stronger with each conquest. In the end, Subject One's people managed to evacuate only a few hundred survivors in escape pods, scattering them across the galaxy in the desperate hope that they could warn other civilizations. And Subject One was one of those survivors? Paul nodded grimly. Its pod had been damaged during the escape, systems failing as it fled through space. The navigation computer had been programmed to seek out worlds with developing civilizations, places where the survivors could share their knowledge and help prepare defenses against the coming darkness. Mike felt the room spinning around him. Are you saying it came here to warn us? Subject 1's ship entered our solar system with its power systems failing and its life support barely functional. The crash near Rachel was an emergency landing, not an exploratory mission. It wasn't here to study us or make contact. It was here to hide, to recover, and to try to warn us about what was coming. Paul's breathing became more laboured. But here's the thing, son. The dark swarm doesn't just destroy randomly. It's intelligent, patient, and it follows a pattern. It consumes worlds in a specific sequence, using the energy from each conquest to grow stronger and locate the next target. How does it locate them? Through electromagnetic signatures, radio transmissions, any evidence of technological civilization, and by studying Subject 1's technology, by powering up its systems and broadcasting signals into space, we had inadvertently created a beacon that the dark swarm could follow. Mike felt his world tilting. Are you saying we led them to Earth? Not intentionally, but yes. Subject 1 tried to warn us, but the communication barrier was too great. We didn't understand what it was trying to tell us until it was too late. Paul's breathing became even more laboured. It was during my 3rd month at the facility that the warnings became impossible to ignore. Paul closed his eyes, his face twisting with the effort of remembering events that his mind had tried to bury for 4 decades. I was working late on a Wednesday evening, alone except for the skeleton security crew. The facility was quiet, just the hum of machinery and the distant sound of footsteps in the corridors above. What happened? That's when every electronic system in the place started going haywire, not just malfunctioning, actively being interfered with by some external force. Lights flickering and dying, computers crashing and rebooting randomly, communication systems erupting in static that almost sounded like voices speaking in unknown languages. Paul's hands were shaking violently now. I ran to the medical bay to check on Subject 1 and found it in a state of complete panic. The being was no longer lying peacefully in its bed. It was pressed against the observation window, its eyes wide with what could only be described as absolute terror. Terror of what? When it saw me, it began frantically manipulating the room's electronics, using its strange ability to interface directly with our technology, creating displays and readouts that I couldn't understand, but that clearly conveyed desperate warnings about something approaching. Paul's voice grew urgent. Dr. Cole arrived within minutes, along with Security Chief Colton Hayes and half the facility's staff. The main computers were showing readings that violated every law of physics we knew. 3 massive objects had appeared on the edge of the solar system, moving at velocities that should have been impossible. Mike gripped the recorder so tightly his knuckles were white. The dark swarm? Paul nodded, his face pale with remembered terror. Each object was larger than a city, and they were heading directly for Earth. But that wasn't the worst part, son. The approach of those things was affecting local space-time around Area 51. Reality itself was beginning to break down. What do you mean? I watched technician Justin Webb walk directly through a solid concrete wall as if it weren't there. Security cameras started showing corridors that led to rooms that didn't exist on any blueprint. Personnel reported finding themselves in sections of the facility that they couldn't locate again when they tried to return. Mike felt his sanity starting to slip. That's impossible. So is travelling faster than light, son. So is a collective entity that can consume entire worlds. But I saw it all with my own eyes. Paul's gaze became distant. The dark swarm wasn't just a physical threat. It was something that existed partially outside our normal space-time. Its approach was warping reality around Earth, making it impossible to mount any kind of conventional defense. Paul's breathing became shallow and rapid. Colton Hayes tried to organize an evacuation, but when security teams went to check certain areas of the base, they found only empty space where buildings should have been. Entire sections of the facility were simply ceasing to exist. as if they had never been built in the first place. What about Subject 1? That's when it made its choice. The being broke free from its medical restraints, not to escape, but to reach its damaged craft. I followed, drawn by a compulsion I couldn't resist, some kind of mental pull that Subject 1 was projecting. Paul's voice became filled with awe and terror. When we reached the research bay, Subject 1 placed its hands on the ship's hull, and the vessel began to glow with an inner light. Systems that had been dead for months suddenly came back to life, and I could feel the craft's power building like a storm about to break. What was it doing? The being was using its own life force to power the ship's defensive systems, creating some kind of barrier around Earth that would hide our planet from the Dark Swarm's senses. But the process was killing it, burning out its nervous system and draining its life energy. Tears were streaming down Paul's face now. I felt Subject 1's thoughts flowing into my mind one last time. It showed me what it was doing, the sacrifice it was making. The barrier would save Earth, but it would only be a temporary solution. What do you mean? The Dark Swarm was too powerful to be stopped permanently. The barrier would hide Earth for a time, maybe 50 years, if we were lucky, but eventually it would weaken and fail. And when that happened, they would return to finish what they had started. Paul's voice became urgent again. The ship's glow intensified until it was almost blinding, and I felt reality shift around me like a rubber sheet being stretched and twisted. The approaching objects on our displays suddenly changed course, moving away from Earth as if they had lost interest, or could no longer detect our planet's presence. The old man's eyes closed and he seemed to age 10 years in an instant. Subject 1 collapsed, its skin fading from that blue-grey colour to white as its life ebbed away. In its final moments, it projected one last message into my mind, a warning that has haunted me for 40 years. What did it say? It showed me the future, son, the Dark Swarm moving through the galaxy like a cancer, consuming world after world, growing stronger with each conquest. It showed me the barrier it had created, slowly weakening over the decades like a dam with cracks spreading through its foundation. And it showed me the day when they would return to Earth, when the barrier would finally fail and leave us defenseless. Paul's eyes opened, and they were filled with a desperate urgency. That day is coming soon, Mike. Very soon. Mike felt the room spinning around him. How soon? My next clear memory was waking up 3 days later in a military hospital in Colorado. The doctors told me I'd been found unconscious in the facility after what they described as a reactor malfunction. 18 people had died in the incident, they said, including Dr. Cole and most of the research team. Paul's voice became bitter. The official reports mentioned nothing about alien technology or extraterrestrial beings. The craft in Subject 1's body had vanished completely, along with all research data and documentation. Every computer file, every photograph, every piece of physical evidence, gone as if it had never existed. What happened to you? I was reassigned to routine electronics work at a base in New Mexico and forced to sign papers that basically erased my memory of the previous 3 months. They gave me a new security clearance, a new identity, and a psychological evaluation that concluded I was suffering from trauma-induced amnesia. Paul's voice carried decades of frustration, but memories have a way of fighting back, especially traumatic ones. The memory suppression was thorough and professional, but over the years, fragments began to return. Dreams at first, then flashes of images during my waking hours, until finally the entire experience came flooding back. Mike leaned forward. When did you remember everything? It took nearly 10 years for the complete memories to return. By then I was married to your mother and trying to build a normal life. But the nightmares never stopped, and I knew I had to find out if what I remembered was real, or if I'd suffered some kind of psychotic break. Paul's hands clenched. into fists. I spent the next 30 years monitoring astronomical data, watching deep space telescopes and satellite feeds for any sign of the objects I remembered seeing. I learned to use computers, studied astrophysics, even got access to classified government databases through contacts I'd made during my military service. "Did you find anything?" Paul's face went pale. "For decades, nothing. I began to think that maybe the memory suppression had been incomplete, that I was chasing shadows from a damaged mind. But last month, I finally found what I was looking for." Mike held his breath. 3 objects, massive beyond comprehension, moving through the outer solar system. They're following the same trajectory they were on before. Subject 1 diverted them, but now they're coming back. The barrier that alien being created is failing, and they can sense Earth again. The heart monitor's beeping began to accelerate. Based on their current trajectory and speed, they'll reach Earth's vicinity around 2029. Maybe sooner if the barrier fails completely. Mike's voice was barely a whisper. "What are we supposed to do? How do we fight something like that?" Paul's eyes filled with tears. "I don't know, son. Subject 1's entire civilization couldn't stop them, and they were far more advanced than we are. But maybe..." He paused, his eyes growing distant. "Maybe there's a way to strengthen the barrier, to buy us more time." "How?" "The other escape pods, the other survivors. Subject 1 wasn't the only one who escaped the destruction of the Garden of First Light. There were hundreds of pods scattered across the galaxy, each carrying refugees who might have knowledge or technology that could help us." Paul's grip on Mike's hand tightened. "If we could find them, if we could make contact and coordinate our defenses, maybe we could find a way to stop the Dark Swarm permanently, or at least delay them long enough for humanity to develop the technology we'd need to fight back." The old man's voice trailed off and his eyes took on a glazed look. "But Mike, there's something else, something I haven't told you yet. Something that makes all of this even more terrifying." Mike felt his blood turn to ice. "What?" Paul's eyes suddenly snapped back into focus, and they were filled with a terror that seemed to go beyond even what he'd already described. "The nightmares I've been having aren't just memories of what Subject 1 showed me. They're new visions, fresh images of what's happening right now." "I don't understand." "The Dark Swarm isn't just coming back to Earth, son. It's been preparing. For 40 years, it's been sending scouts, small probes that can slip through the barrier without triggering its defenses. They've been studying us, learning about our technology, our weaknesses, our military capabilities." Mike felt the room growing colder. "Studying us how?" "The abductions, the sightings, the encounters that people report. They're not random. The Dark Swarm is selecting specific individuals, altering them in ways that won't be detected until it's too late. When they finally arrive, they'll have allies already in place. People who look human but have been programmed to serve their purposes." Mike stared at his father in horror. "How many?" "Thousands, maybe tens of thousands. Politicians, military leaders, scientists, journalists, anyone in a position of influence or authority. They're building a network, son. A system of control that will make resistance impossible when the time comes." "But you said the barrier was still holding." "It is, but it's weakening faster than Subject 1 predicted. The constant probing, the scout ships, the modifications they're making to selected humans, it's all working to weaken the barrier from within." Paul's eyes filled with tears. "We have maybe 5 years left, not 10. Mike felt his world collapsing around him. "Dad, this is insane. You're talking about a cosmic conspiracy that's been going on for decades." Paul's voice became urgent. "I know how it sounds, son. I know how impossible it all seems. But there's more. Things I discovered after my memories returned. Things that prove the government knows about the Dark Swarm and has been preparing for their arrival." What things? The facility where I worked, Level C beneath Area 51. It's still there, still operational. The government knows about the dark swarm, knows about the barrier, knows about the approaching deadline. And they've been preparing, but not to fight. What do you mean? Deep underground bunkers, seed banks, genetic repositories. They're planning to preserve a small portion of humanity while the rest of the world burns. They know they can't stop what's coming, so they're planning to hide and wait it out. Mike felt sick. How do you know this? Because they've been watching me for 40 years, son. Every move I've made, every piece of research I've done, every attempt to contact other survivors, they've known about all of it. That's why I'm really dying, Mike. Not from emphysema, but from the treatments they've been giving me to keep me quiet. What treatments? Slow-acting toxins designed to mimic natural illness. They couldn't risk killing me outright. Too many people knew about my work at Area 51. But they could make sure I died slowly, quietly, taking my secrets with me. Paul's voice became weak. Except I'm not going to let that happen. Mike stared at his father in shock. You're saying the government poisoned you? I'm saying they've been controlling the narrative for 40 years, making sure the truth never gets out. But now the barrier is failing, and they're running out of time to implement their survival plans. Paul's breathing became shallow. That's why I'm telling you this, son. Someone needs to know the truth. Needs to prepare people for what's coming. The heart monitor's beeping began to slow, and Paul's eyes started to close. But there's one more thing, Mike. One more secret that changes everything. Mike leaned closer to his father. What? Paul's voice became barely audible. I wasn't the only one who developed a connection with Subject 1. There were others, technicians and researchers, who were affected by prolonged exposure to the being. Most of them were transferred or eliminated, but a few survived. Survived how? They were changed, son. The contact with Subject 1 altered their brain chemistry, gave them abilities that normal humans don't possess. Telepathic sensitivity, enhanced pattern recognition, the ability to sense electromagnetic anomalies. Paul's eyes opened one last time. I was one of them. Mike felt the world tilting. What are you saying? The visions I've been having, the nightmares about the dark swarm. They're not just memories. They're real-time communications from the other survivors, scattered across the galaxy. Subject 1's people are still out there, still fighting, still trying to find a way to stop the darkness. Paul's grip on his son's hand tightened with surprising strength. And they've been sending messages, Mike. Coordinates, technical specifications, plans for weapons that might be able to fight the dark swarm. But the messages are encoded in ways that only the altered humans can understand. Where are these messages? Hidden in radio telescope data, in satellite transmissions, in deep space observations that most scientists dismiss as background noise. But to someone with the right neural modifications, they're as clear as spoken words. Paul's voice became urgent. That's why they've been poisoning me, son. They know I can decode the messages, and they're terrified of what those messages contain. Mike's hands were shaking now. What do the messages say? They're building something, Mike. The survivors, the refugees from 100 dead worlds. They're working together to create a weapon that might be able to stop the dark swarm permanently. But they need help from civilizations that haven't been consumed yet. Worlds like Earth that still have the resources and population to contribute to the effort. Paul's breathing became laboured, but his voice remained focused. The weapon requires specific materials, rare elements that can only be found in certain types of star systems. Earth has some of these materials, deep in our planet's core, but extracting them would require technology we don't possess. What kind of technology? Gravity manipulation systems, matter converters that can work at the subatomic level, power sources that can harness the energy of entire stars. The survivors have been sharing this information through the hidden messages, trying to coordinate a galaxy-wide resistance effort. Paul's eyes grew distant. But time is running out, son. The dark swarm has been growing stronger. With each world it consumes, and it's learned to detect the communication signals the survivors use. More and more of the refugee civilizations have gone silent, either discovered and destroyed, or forced to shut down their transmissions to avoid detection. Mike felt overwhelmed by the scope of what his father was describing. Dad, even if all this is true, what can we do? We're just two people. You're wrong about that, Mike. Dead wrong. Paul's voice took on new strength. There are others like me, other humans, who were altered by contact with alien technology. We've been finding each other over the years, drawn together by shared experiences and abilities that normal people can't understand. How many others? At least 50 that I know of, scattered across the globe. Former military personnel, scientists, technicians, all of them exposed to recovered alien technology at various government facilities. Most don't even realize what happened to them, but they all report the same symptoms: enhanced pattern recognition, sensitivity to electromagnetic fields, and dreams filled with images of distant worlds. Paul struggled to sit up in his hospital bed. We've been building a network, Mike. Sharing information, decoding the hidden messages, preparing for the day when the dark swarm returns. But we need more people, more resources, more time. What kind of network? We call ourselves the Watchers. We monitor deep space transmissions, track unusual astronomical phenomena, and maintain contact with the survivor civilizations through encrypted quantum channels that the government can't detect or intercept. Mike's mind was reeling. Quantum channels. Technology we've reverse engineered from the hidden messages. The survivors have been teaching us, step by step, how to build communication systems that exist partially outside normal space-time. It's the only way to coordinate resistance efforts without being detected by the Dark Swarm scouts. Paul's voice became urgent again. But the government knows about us, Mike. They've been systematically eliminating the Watchers, making it look like accidents or natural deaths. Heart attacks, car crashes, sudden illnesses. They're picking us off one by one to prevent us from organizing an effective resistance. Is that why they're killing you? I'm not just another Watcher, son. I'm one of the original contactees, one of the few humans who had direct mental contact with Subject 1. That makes me a primary target, but it also makes me invaluable to the resistance effort. Paul reached under his pillow and pulled out a small device that looked like a modified cell phone. This is a quantum communicator built using specifications from the survivor messages. It's been recording everything we've said, transmitting our conversation to Watcher cells around the world. Mike stared at the device in amazement. Why? Because you're going to replace me, Mike. You're going to carry on the work when I'm gone. Paul's eyes met his son's directly. The genetic modifications that made me sensitive to alien communications are hereditary. You have the same abilities I do, they just haven't been activated yet. Activated how? By exposure to the quantum field generated by this communicator. It's been subtly altering your brain chemistry throughout our conversation, awakening dormant neural pathways that will allow you to decode the survivor messages. Paul's voice became solemn. I'm sorry, son. I never wanted to burden you with this, but there's no choice left. Mike felt a strange tingling sensation in his head, as if something was rewiring itself behind his eyes. I can feel it. Something's changing. The process will continue for several hours after I die. By tomorrow morning, you'll be able to hear the messages clearly, to understand the technical specifications, and coordinate plans that the survivors are transmitting. Paul's voice grew weaker. But you need to be careful, Mike. The government monitors all electronic communications, and they've developed algorithms that can detect quantum channel signatures. How do I avoid detection? The other watchers will find you. They'll know when your abilities activate, and they'll make contact within 48 hours. Follow their instructions, trust their experience, and never use conventional communication methods to discuss anything related to the Dark Swarm. Paul's breathing became shallow and irregular. There's something else, son. Something about the timeline that makes everything even more urgent. What do you mean? The barrier isn't just weakening naturally. The Dark Swarm has been actively attacking it, using weapons that exist in multiple dimensions simultaneously. They've been testing its strength, probing for weak points, preparing for a final assault that will bring it down completely. Mike felt his blood turn to ice. When? Based on the quantum fluctuations the Watchers have been monitoring, we estimate the barrier will fail completely within 18 months. Not 5 years, not 3 years. 18 months at the outside. The heart monitor's alarms began to sound as Paul's vital signs spiked dangerously. That's why the government has accelerated their bunker program, why they've been eliminating Watchers more aggressively. They know the end is coming, and they're trying to eliminate any chance of organized resistance. Mike felt tears streaming down his face. Dad, what am I supposed to do with all this? Paul's voice became barely audible. Find Dr. Amanda Wells at the Arecibo Observatory. She's one of us, one of the Watchers, though she doesn't know it yet. Her research into deep space anomalies has been guided by subconscious messages from the survivors. What about her? She's been detecting the Davidson objects for months, tracking their approach without realizing what they really are. When your abilities fully activate, you'll be able to help her decode the technical specifications hidden in their transmission patterns. Paul's grip on Mike's hand was weakening. The survivors have been using the approaching Dark Swarm entities as relay stations, bouncing messages off their energy fields to create communication channels that can't be intercepted by conventional means. What kind of specifications? Blueprints for the weapon, Mike. The galaxy killer that might be able to stop the Dark Swarm permanently. But building it will require resources from dozens of worlds, coordination between hundreds of survivor civilizations, and technology that pushes the boundaries of what's physically possible. Paul's eyes were starting to close. The weapon works by inverting the Dark Swarm's own feeding process, turning their ability to consume life energy against them. Instead of draining worlds, it would drain the swarm itself, collapsing their collective consciousness and dispersing their individual components back into normal space-time. How long would it take to build? If we started today with full cooperation from every government on Earth and unlimited resources, maybe 15 years. But we don't have 15 years, Mike. We have 18 months, and most of that time will be spent trying to convince people that the threat is real. Paul's voice became urgent one last time. That's why the recording is so important, son. It's not just my confession. It's proof that the government has known about this threat for decades and has been covering it up. When people hear it, when they see the astronomical data that confirms the approaching objects, maybe they'll finally take action. Mike leaned closer as his father's words became barely audible. But even if they do, even if the whole world mobilizes to build the weapon, there's no guarantee it will work. The Dark Swarm has encountered resistance before, and it's learned to adapt its strategies. What are you saying? I'm saying we might fail, Mike, despite everything we do, despite all our efforts and sacrifices. The Dark Swarm might still win. And if that happens, if Earth falls like all the other worlds, then humanity's only hope will be the escape plan. What escape plan? The survivors have been preparing evacuation ships, vessels that can travel faster than light and carry small populations to distant galaxies where the Dark Swarm hasn't spread yet. Earth-based humanity would cease to exist, but the species would survive to start again somewhere else. Paul's eyes opened one final time, and they were filled with a mixture of love, terror, and desperate hope. Promise me something, son. Promise me that whatever happens, whatever choices you have to make, you'll remember that the goal isn't just to save Earth. It's to preserve the spark of consciousness that makes intelligent life worth protecting. Mike nodded, tears blurring his vision. I promise, Dad. The darkness between stars is real, Mike. It's ancient and hungry and patient, beyond human comprehension, but it's not unstoppable. Subject 1 proved that when it sacrificed itself to protect Earth, and the survivors prove it every day by continuing to fight against impossible odds. Paul's voice became barely a whisper. Tell them, son. Tell everyone who will listen. Make them understand what's at stake, what's coming for all of us. And if the worst happens, if the dark swarm wins and Earth falls, make sure that some part of humanity survives to carry on the fight. Those were Paul Davidson's last coherent words. He died peacefully, his hand still gripping his son's, but Mike noticed something extraordinary as his father passed away. The hospital room's lights began to dim and flicker in a complex pattern, as if some invisible intelligence was using the electrical system to send a message. The quantum communicator in Paul's other hand glowed briefly with an inner light, then went dark. Mike sat in the growing darkness for a long time after his father died, trying to process everything he had heard. The story was incredible, impossible, but something in his father's eyes had convinced him it was true. Paul Davidson had been carrying these secrets for 40 years, and now that burden had been passed to his son. As the hours passed, Mike began to feel the changes his father had described. A tingling sensation behind his eyes grew stronger, and he started to perceive patterns in the ambient electromagnetic fields around the hospital. The fluorescent lights weren't just flickering randomly, they were pulsing in complex sequences that seemed to contain information. By morning, the transformation was complete. Mike could hear whispers in the static between radio stations, see mathematical equations floating in the air, feel the presence of vast intelligences communicating across impossible distances. The survivor messages that his father had described were suddenly as clear as spoken words, carrying technical specifications and coordinate plans for a resistance effort that spanned the galaxy. The first contact came exactly as Paul had predicted. 46 hours after his father's death, Mike received a phone call from someone who identified herself only as Echo 7. She spoke in code phrases that somehow made perfect sense to his altered consciousness, providing instructions for a meeting that would take place in 3 days. Mike spent those 3 days listening to the survivor messages and beginning to understand the true scope of the threat facing Earth. The Dark Swarm wasn't just a collection of entities that consumed worlds. It was a manifestation of entropy itself, a force that sought to return the universe to its original state of primordial chaos. The meeting took place in an abandoned warehouse outside Las Vegas, attended by 23 people who looked like ordinary civilians, but whose eyes held the same altered awareness that Mike had begun to recognize in himself. They called themselves the Las Vegas Cell, one of dozens of watcher groups operating around the world. Dr. Amanda Wells was among them, her astronomical research having led her to discover the approaching objects months before anyone else in the scientific community took them seriously. She'd been experiencing the same dreams and visions that affected all the watchers, though she hadn't understood their significance until now. Your father's confession is spreading, she told Mike during a break in the briefing. We've uploaded it to every platform we can access, and it's being translated into dozens of languages. Government agencies are trying to suppress it, but the internet makes that almost impossible. Mike nodded, still adjusting to his enhanced perceptions. How many people believe it? More than you might think. The astronomical evidence is becoming harder to ignore, and people are starting to connect the dots between your father's story and their own experiences with unexplained phenomena. Dr. Wells pulled out a tablet showing satellite imagery of the approaching objects. We've confirmed their trajectory and acceleration patterns. They'll reach Earth's vicinity in approximately 16 months, not 18 as your father estimated. Mike felt his blood run cold. Can we build the weapon in time? Not with current resources and government opposition, but we're not just relying on official channels. Dr. Wells gestured to the other watchers in the room. We've been developing our own manufacturing capabilities, using reverse-engineered alien technology to create production facilities that can work at the molecular level. Is it enough? It has to be, because it's all we have. The survivor civilizations are providing technical support, but they can't send physical assistance without alerting the Dark Swarm to their locations. We're essentially on our own. Over the following months, Mike threw himself into the resistance effort with the same dedication his father had shown during his 40 years of secret research. The Watcher network expanded rapidly as more people reported experiencing enhanced perceptions and alien contact experiences. The government's response was swift and brutal. Watcher cells were raided by unmarked military units. Key researchers disappeared without explanation, and the official media began a campaign to discredit Paul Davidson's confession as an elaborate hoax designed to spread panic. But the truth had a momentum of its own. Independent astronomers confirmed the existence of the approaching objects. Leaked government documents revealed decades of alien technology research, and people around the world began reporting dreams and visions that matched the survivors' warnings about the Dark Swarm. By late 2025, the existence of the objects could no longer be denied. Government officials around the world issued carefully worded statements acknowledging the presence of large artificial constructs in the outer solar system, though they stopped short of confirming their extraterrestrial origin or hostile intent. The revelation sparked worldwide panic and social upheaval. Stock markets crashed, religious movements declared the end times, and millions of people demanded immediate action to address the approaching threat. But the official response was inadequate, focused more on maintaining social order than mounting an effective defense. The Watchers knew they were running out of time. The quantum barrier was weakening faster than anyone had predicted, and the Dark Swarm entities were accelerating their approach as they sensed Earth's growing vulnerability. In desperation, the survivor civilizations began transmitting more detailed technical specifications, providing blueprints for weapons and defensive systems that pushed the boundaries of human understanding. But each transmission carried the risk of detection, and several survivor worlds went silent after broadcasting critical information to Earth. Mike found himself at the center of the resistance effort, his inherited connection to Subject 1 making him uniquely qualified to decode the most complex survivor messages. Through these communications, he learned that the weapon they were trying to build, officially designated the Consciousness Inverter, had been attempted before by other civilizations. None of those attempts had succeeded. The Dark Swarm had encountered the weapon's predecessors and had developed countermeasures that rendered them ineffective. Each time a civilization tried to use the inverter technology, the Dark Swarm adapted its feeding process to neutralize the weapon's effects. This information came too late to change the Watcher's strategy, but it did provide crucial data about the Dark Swarm's weaknesses. The entities weren't truly immortal. They could be damaged, diminished, even temporarily dispersed. The key was finding a way to attack them before they could adapt their defenses. As 2026 began, the quantum barrier showed signs of critical failure. Reality distortions similar to those Paul had witnessed at Area 51 began occurring around the world, though on a much smaller scale. People reported walking through solid objects, finding themselves in locations that didn't exist on any map, and encountering beings that looked human but felt fundamentally wrong. The dark swarm's advance, scouts had begun slipping through the weakened barrier in greater numbers, preparing the way for their master's arrival. These scouts didn't attack directly. Instead, they worked to accelerate the barrier's collapse by introducing chaos and discord into human society. Political movements that promoted violence and division suddenly gained unprecedented support. Environmental disasters struck with suspicious frequency and coordination. Technology failures cascaded through critical infrastructure systems in patterns that seemed almost designed to maximize social disruption. Mike and the other Watchers realized they were fighting a war on multiple fronts, not just against the approaching Dark Swarm entities, but against the scout forces that were already among them and the human collaborators who had been converted to serve their agenda. The government's response became increasingly authoritarian as the situation deteriorated. Martial law was declared in major cities. Internet communications were heavily monitored, and anyone suspected of belonging to the Watcher network faced indefinite detention without trial. But the resistance continued to grow, fueled by leaked evidence of government cover-ups and the undeniable reality of the approaching threat. Independent scientists published data confirming the object's artificial nature and hostile intent, while whistleblowers revealed the existence of deep, underground bunkers where selected elites planned to wait out humanity's destruction. Dr. Amanda Wells emerged as one of the Resistance's most effective leaders, using her scientific credentials to legitimize the Watcher's warnings, while secretly coordinating the construction of the consciousness inverter. The weapon's components were being manufactured in hidden facilities around the world, each one disguised as legitimate industrial operations. The challenge was assembly. The inverter required precision beyond anything humanity had ever attempted, with tolerances measured in subatomic particles and energy requirements that would drain the entire global power grid in a matter of minutes. Worse still, the weapon could only be used once. If it failed to destroy the Dark Swarm completely, the entities would adapt their defenses and become immune to future attacks. Humanity would have one chance, and one chance only, to save itself and every other threatened world in the galaxy. As the deadline approached, Mike found himself thinking more and more about his father's final words. Paul had spoken of preserving the spark of consciousness that made intelligent life worth protecting, and Mike began to understand what that meant. The war against the Dark Swarm wasn't just about survival. It was about maintaining the qualities that made existence meaningful. Love, creativity, curiosity, the drive to explore and understand the universe. These were the things that the Dark Swarm sought to consume, and they were the things that made the fight worthwhile, regardless of its outcome. In early 2027, the quantum barrier suffered a cascade failure that allowed the Dark Swarm entities to detect Earth's location once again. The three massive objects immediately altered course, accelerating toward the inner solar system with predatory intent. The final phase of humanity's test had begun, and Mike Davidson carried the weight of his father's legacy as he prepared to face the darkness between stars with courage inherited from an alien refugee who had sacrificed everything to give humanity a chance. The consciousness inverter was nearly complete, hidden in a facility deep beneath the Nevada desert, just 50 miles from where Paul had first encountered Subject 1. The irony wasn't lost on Mike. Humanity's last hope lay buried in the same sands where the warning had first been given 44 years earlier. As the Dark Swarm entities crossed the orbit of Jupiter, Mike stood in the weapons control chamber and thought about his father's final promise. Whatever happened in the next few days, whatever choices he had to make, he would remember that the goal wasn't just to save Earth. It was to preserve the spark of consciousness that made the universe worth protecting, to ensure that somewhere among the stars, the fight for light and life would continue, even if Earth fell to darkness. The countdown to humanity's final battle had begun.